Obrigada.
Hi, everyone. So this is the 5th session of the International Online Conference on Women in Science, Technology, Engineering, Art, and Mathematics, with the subtitle of Resilience, Sustainability, and Governance. In this session, we will be hearing from Sofia Lai Amândio. The conference is bilingual. Sofia will be speaking in English. Sofia, thank you for coming.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So I will start by presenting myself. I'm a sociologist, a PhD sociologist, and for more than 20 years, I've been working on research. And in these more recent years, I've started some new paths, and my presentation will be precisely based on this binary path. So I will start by sharing my presentation. And are you seeing okay?
Let me see just the one of the slides. Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation, Professor Carlos Pedro Gonçalves. I'm really happy to share my experience with you and our internet viewers. I will storytell my path as a researcher in social sciences and in sociology in particular. And to do that, I will speak about my options along the way and explain what led me to build this, what I've called the binary path, a path inside and outside the academy. And as I was preparing my presentation, I found part of my story written in a newspaper article. This is not surprising because what researchers live, what researchers feel, is in part explained by structural opportunities that constrain our trajectories. There is a lot of literature on the work conditions of researchers, but this newspaper article, published in Público by the sociologist Mariana Gai Alves, president of the National Higher Education Union, pinpoints the very ambivalence that researchers face in Portugal between enchantment and discouragement. Mariana Gai Alves starts by an evidence that many researchers are considering abandoning science, driven by the discouragement that stems from the lack of recognition of their work. But then she tries to explain it by the revealing idea of contradictory emotions. So on the one hand, the enchantment for the profession, learning to do science, requires a great personal investment in an academic training process that lasts for many years in several moments, with several moments of satisfaction. On the other hand, the conditions under which science is done are uncertain and lead to anxiety. The majority of researchers, at the same time, they carry out research that pays their salary. They also are looking for funding that ensures the continuity of their work. So one of the signs of this precarity is the fact that from 2008 to 2020, around 2,700 vacancies were put up for competition for fixed-term contracts and only 60 for positions in scientific career. I'm no exception in these numbers, and all my path has been built over this ambivalence of passion versus discouragement. I looked up the numbers considering gender and race. There are no data considering ethnicity and race in research in Portugal. However, concerning gender, and according to the most recent report of 2020 about the situation of women and men in research published by Elsevier, Portugal was the closest to gender parity in terms of women's representation in research. Portugal is the only European country in which women did not leave research at a higher rate than men over time. And in Portugal, women comprise more than 50 of doctoral graduates, scientists, engineers, and employed professionals, demonstrating gender parity across scientific career pathways. So in this context, I would like to share a little bit of my experience. I've started my studies in the 90s and did all my degrees in sociology, bachelor, master's, and PhD in all these universities logos that are appearing in the slideshow. And these universities correspond to Lisbon, Paris, Lyon, and Leicester. My goal was to have an international experience and to enhance all chances of having an academic career. I've also been curious for very different subjects, emotions and social sciences, sociology of culture, managers and management, professional paths, managers' emotions, and more recently, I've started studying about or in the frame of public policies. And as every researcher that wants to add up some experience, I've lectured in several universities, and in particular at the University of Lyon for 3 years, my only experience by contract. I also worked in different research centers in Portugal, England, and France. And although specialization is the academic paradigm, we must specialize. It's like this slogan that we listen throughout our careers. I've always been interested in very different themes, sometimes also for funding reasons, like gender and emotions, socialization, scientific development, education policies, emotions, and social theory. After my PhD, I started to think about science communication, about the importance of connecting with people and bringing sociology to people. I've published the results of my thesis at Le Monde Diplomatique, the Portuguese version. And after participating in a team project as a postdoctoral researcher, I coordinated a national research and development project on empowering the relation between university and civil society with 17 other researchers from 5 Portuguese universities. And this view brings us until today. I must say that to escape precarity or a kind of self-exploitation that lies among research, I've opted out and tried to access the best of the two worlds, inside and out of the research world. So my passion is definitely in social sciences, but my working conditions are elsewhere. I'm a researcher at ISCTE and a senior professional working for the European funds. And again, this kind of professional pathway is not specific to researchers, but also, for instance, to writers. As pointed out in this book published by my PhD supervisor, Bernard Lahire. In this book, he talks about the way in which writers can have 2 lives, 2 professional lives, and how writers can have other professions so that they are allowed or they have all the conditions to do what they love, which is writing. So more recently, what I've been trying to do is to think about how to combine these 2 activities. And more recently, precisely, I've started a research on the European funds that I've published in a newspaper and that will be published in scientific journals from September on. And it's research about, well, I've read 30 years of European funds legislation applied to Portugal and to applied to the European funds in Portugal. So national and European legislation applied to the European funds in Portugal. And I've come up to some interesting conclusions that I'm trying to share in a science communication drive. So
could you just return to that slide?
Of course.
For those who don't read Portuguese, this is a highly dangerous title, which is "Paperwork is the political weapon of European funds." It's one of those titles that will scare many politicians.
Yes, well, I must say you're absolutely right. I forgot to translate.
No, okay. But it's a great title. Especially in Europe, it's one of those that's really on the point.
Well, I'm not. I cannot say that everybody was happy with this article. But but I can also say that from a labor point of view, I did a legitimate publication, which is quite interesting because there are no conflicts of interests by publishing this article, because I'm not revealing confidential information with which I work every day. This is related to a larger data basis that I'm building, but it's on the same theme. And I'm very happy that you've pointed out the fact that it's a provocative title, because this is a warm or a sexy press title, but it's also true. And this is what I'm trying to do about science communication, is to make it persuasive, but based in this case of 30 years of legislation reading and treatment. And this is what scientists can do. They can bring up the best of two worlds to share all the knowledge that we have without having an illicit laboral behavior. I would like to finish this presentation by thinking that by saying that it's urgent to define solutions for the exercise of scientific work with dignity in Portugal. It's urgent to update the scientific research career statute, which dates back to 1999. Although Portugal is the only European country in which women did not leave research at a higher rate than men over time, there are more and more signs that many researchers are considering abandoning science, driven by the lack of recognition of their work. It is time to make passion prevail over discouragement by creating new ways of doing science and producing knowledge, by building a double path or other individual collective strategies to find a better quality of life that we equally deserve. And especially since we are challenged by the knowledge society, it is very important to exercise this knowledge transfer from field to field And I think that's something that I've inherited from the sociology, is that we have to shake mentalities. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sofia. It was a great presentation. I actually feel that there are a few points that are fundamental. They affect all science, indeed, and not just in Europe. In US also have that model of the scientists that to work in science, one has scholarships that have to meet certain productivity requirements, and many of the salaries are paid by scholarships and that begin at a certain point and at a certain point, and there's a precarity and very low pay for scientists. At the same time, we have corporations taking that profit a lot from that research, that especially fundamental research. And there's this interesting distribution, poor distribution, except for those scientists that work in large corporations, the new data scientists and that people that exit. But in the academic careers and the researcher careers, it's a real issue, the precarity. Also the issue of the interdisciplinarity. We have that publish or perish, but if we don't specialize, even a little interdisciplinarity can be difficult to publish, especially in the higher ranking journals that are completely focused without, they don't see outside that box. It's really interesting point. I'd like to hear about your new research a little more. It's very interesting that you show how bureaucracy can be used for political manipulation. It's really interesting.
Actually, I was struck by reading all this legislation and realizing that the word simplification appears since the first document legal document applied to the European funds. And this happens at the same time as there is more legislation about European funds. Meanwhile, there's a document from the Tribunal de Contas, Portuguese Tribunal de Contas, saying that legislation is becoming more and more complicated, complex, incoherent, and the court itself recognizes that legislation is not becoming legislation interpretation easier. 30 years after, legislation is much more prolix, much more extensive, and they continue to talk about simplification. However, they are not really simplifying, they are delaying financial execution. And at the same time, in the backstage of the negotiations between the state members, some state members are against the European cohesion policy, and they want to start up a different kind of funding of countries. So
they use it's a little bit like financial derivatives. You make the contracts so compact, so difficult to read, lack of transparency almost. It's so difficult that you can't understand, that it's easier to manipulate things from there. It's a very interesting point. As a woman in science, your experiences, sociology is, you talked about almost parity. In Europe, it's more or less the same. So I'd like to have a view of the experience of women in the social sciences. What can you say about that?
As I try to point out, I believe it's important to look up to social problems through the lenses of gender. However, the most recent study published at Elsevier about women in research in Portugal shows that there's an equality, an equity among researchers from the point of view of financing and access to work. From the European point of view, I didn't look up the data. From a subjective point of view, what I felt is that in France, at the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, which is this huge public financement center that every country would like to have, and that every time that the French go to the United States and they talk about the CNRS, they say, oh my God, that exists. Yes, that's social state. And opportunities were very equal. What I felt, but it's a very subjective and not an impression based on studies, is that as my PhD supervisor says, what stratifies is not the level of education, is the theme of the education. So I think that to make a parallel, I think that access to research in France is not conditioned by gender. There's not a filter, although it is easier to access to some themes than other, because themes are genderified. So we don't have an hierarchy leveled by gender, because women can be researchers and direct laboratories, but it's easier by theme to enter certain subjects. And in particular, the research center in which I've worked, there were not many politicized themes, and there were much more women. But this is a very dangerous statement, because I'm not basing myself in a study. It's just, I think that there's an invisible filter to access to certain themes, not degrees. So it's an horizontal hierarchy, not a vertical hierarchy. This is my impression from the French experience. In my experience in Leicester, I must say, and I was not prepared to talk about this because I did a very close presentation with slides, very rational.
And speak freely. If you saw the other ones, that they were highly informal. It's another framework that for another form of doing a conference that online, and it's more informal. A different approach to international virtual conferences. My experience was with formal conferences until so. This is the first conference that I'm doing completely online. Completely virtual, and using and the format ends up being more informal than those conferences that people are present. They are all there, physically there. It's an interesting point. But the idea is to have a conference where people can speak freely, of course, and the idea is to divulge the conference. It's not that event that starts there and ends there with closed doors. It's an open. It's open to the world in terms of divulging online in the next few days. Even after the conference, I'll continue to divulge the website, the results, the videos, and so on. And people will see it, and perhaps even comment on YouTube some of the presentations. So it's this more dynamical system that it's the first. I didn't know if I would pull it off. To be honest, it's working. It's working really well. At least in my view, it's working really well. But you were I was actually you have very interesting research, and I'll ask you about your research. I know it in some way it diverges from the conference, but I had to ask you about your research because it's really interesting. But about your experience, I am curious because we don't have here at this conference even we have the experience of people in management and in governance, and women that had in the first day, women that had high positions in office and in the academia also. But I wanted the perspective of researchers in social science, really, because I have the perspective of the tech side, which is my area. And if you but I come from the social sciences too, so I have these interdisciplinary mixes, these strange mixes also. So because I'm from management, my licentiate degree is in management, and I MSc in finance, and the doctorate is in risk mathematics. And then I went to computer science, quantum computing, and I'm working in quantum computing now. So, and I have problems with, I tend to have interdisciplinary papers, and sometimes it's difficult to publish interdisciplinary papers, because I tend to think interdisciplinarily and to bring social sciences even to the hard sciences, or not hard sciences, to mathematics, to tech, and so on. And it becomes difficult to publish that. The thinking, in terms of boxes, is still very present, that specialized thinking that you spoke of. But I wanted the perspective, because the gender gap is immense in technology. We can see that in the courses. My perspective on sociology, and I taught at this ISCTE sociology students, and I saw that there was more or less a gender parity in terms of number of students, but in the social sciences that there needs to be more women in social science.
Exactly.
Than in the tech world, in the engineering, and so on. And I wanted this perspective from a social scientist, which is, I think it's fundamental. So your perspective of women in social science, but this issue that you raise about theme choice is very interesting. It's a very interesting one, because
our Secretary of State for Equality, she supports studies about engenheiras por dia, and she wants to, by theme, encourage more women to access disciplines that usually they don't have automatic access to, as men do. So she's promoting a sensibilization of students in secondary school and asking young girls, what are you studying afterwards? Oh no, engineering is for men. So she's trying to level these thematic opportunities by sensibilization.
It's a curious point, because I saw it in a study, and Inês Garcia yesterday said something about not remembering a single woman in science, a scientist. Name a famous female scientist. She couldn't name a famous female scientist. Name a famous, and this was tested in the US. Name a famous woman working in tech that is an influencer. If you think about tech influencers, think right away about the Elon Musks, the Bill Gates, and so on. But what about women? And there are women working in tech, but this lack of cultural visibility, I think is a problem that social sciences could help solve in terms of research and how to promote this visibility of women in science in general. And it's an interesting issue because there's no visibility in terms of role models of women. These examples, mediatic examples, are only men, and it's an interesting point when social science can bring something into it. That's my view. So thank you very much, Sofia.
Thank you so much, Carlos.
I hope I'll be accompanying your research and hope to hear from you again about that very interesting research that will put some politicians with less hair, perhaps, or their hair standing up with more titles like that.
I hope so.
Bureaucracy as a political weapon. That's great. That's great. Thank you very much. The video will be made available today. I'll send you then the video as soon as it's available, and we'll divulge it online as we did the others. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carlos, for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for accepting it. It was a great talk. And so I'm closing the session. Thanks. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.